Hi, everybody, and thanks for joining me today on this walk for peace that we are embarking on together. Looking at what walking for peace means for me and for Alberto as well. 25 years later. I mean, obviously, we are not the same people that we were 25 years ago. Our beliefs, our fears, our ideas, our beliefs in general about who we are and what peace means to us has evolved as it naturally would, over time. That inner journey that we were on during that walk certainly did not end in Jerusalem. It continued afterwards, and it continues, to be honest, to this day. And to really understand what that walk was all about, I think it's important to understand the context inside of which it happened. I didn't just simply wake up one day and say, okay, let's go walk 5,000 kilometers for peace from Rome to Jerusalem. It certainly wasn't like that. It was a series of events that were building up to the moment when that call came. And truly, I can say that it was a calling that came for me in answer to what I was truly seeking at that time. So remember, this is back in 2001. And at that time, I would have been, let's see, I was 36. I had just quit my job, really. I had quit my job the year earlier at Microsoft. I had quit everything that had defined me. I had quit my career, my identity in many ways, really. And it took a long time for me to be able to answer the question which everybody asks you. So, what do you do? And I didn't know how to answer, what do you do? I always, in the beginning anyways, I answered it, well, I used to work for Microsoft. I used to work in the tech industry. I used to be, in, a marketing or a product manager. And I was in that kind of space of not really knowing how to identify like who I was after leaving behind something which had defined who I was, obviously, for so many years. And so, had left obviously the financial security of leaving a full-time job behind. I had left that behind. I was, unexpectedly divorced. I didn't, quite know how I had gotten to where I was. I didn't know what had happened. I thought I had played by the rules. I thought I had done all the right things. And to see that fall apart really was like a slap in the face. It's like I thought I had done all the right things. I thought I had, played by the rules that said, you get an education, you get a job, you get married, and you build a life with someone, and you stay together. It's a very kind of traditional, very simple way of looking at life. It wasn't like a grand big dream. It was just something that seemed normal. That's all. That I didn't have any aspirations kind of beyond that, beyond being a good person, working hard, and being in a loving relationship. And obviously, continue to build my career and continue to climb, I guess, that corporate ladder. That was really all that I knew at that time. And all that had fallen apart, which kind of began the whole questioning process. So I was going through all of that, trying to process what had happened, trying to understand what had happened. At that time, this is 2001, all I knew was that I was starting to travel. I felt the call had come for me to travel. I bought a one-way return ticket to Canada, leaving in January, coming back in January a year later. I really didn't have any plans. I didn't have any big ideas of what I wanted to do. I did start in Egypt. I felt that's kind of where I was being guided. And so I went to Egypt. I lived and stayed in Egypt for about 3, 4 months. I continued traveling around the Mediterranean, Greece, met up with some friends and girlfriends and went, to Greece, went to Italy, made my way to the south of France, arrived on the Camino. I would have arrived around May of that year of 2001. And essentially looked for anything, a guidebook, anything that would guide me on how to walk this path. Remember, this is back in 2001. I didn't have a cell phone. There were no cell phones that were, ubiquitous like you would find today. There wasn't immediate access to information. If I wanted to learn anything or get on the internet, I had to go to an internet cafe. Remember those where you had to pay by, I guess, by the minute, by the hour, whatever it was, with dial-up access to the internet, nothing, no wireless access. There weren't websites that, as there are today, dedicated to informing the pilgrim, about all the different paths and what's available and how to walk and how to prepare. I didn't have any of those things. I just arrived in Saint Jean-Pied-de-Port. I looked for anything that was in English. I found the one English guidebook. I should bring that out because I still have the guidebook. The one guidebook that was available, I bought that, and I said, okay, let's follow what this book is telling me. So, that was kind of the outer kind of what was happening at that time, early in 2001. And like I said, I was just trying to figure out my life. How did I get here? What am I, and also more importantly, what am I going to do with my life? I'm still young. I was only 36 back then. And I was asking the big questions of my life. I didn't just want to go back to the corporate world, although I knew that was always an option. I wanted to do something that had a sense of meaning. I really wanted to use this as an opportunity to examine my life, examine what had happened, examine maybe the mistakes I had made along the way, examining, just kind of the deeper meaning of everything. And although I didn't verbalize it, I didn't say it out loud, I think what I was truly looking for, what I was truly asking for, seeking, was peace. Peace in my heart, peace in my mind, peace in my life in general. And I had no idea how to get that. Really, I didn't know. I was going through, obviously, an inner shift. That's clear. There was the divorce and the quitting of the job. All of that was part of, I would say, that question, that deeper inner shift. What's going on. And that shift really was a spiritual one. Obviously, it wasn't, you can't, I don't think, be asking all these big questions about your life and continue to look to the world to give you the same answers that it has always given you. And I did try, I did traditional therapy, I talked to therapists, but it just wasn't filling something that was missing. And that missing piece, led me into spiritual terrain. And, I can't say that I had a religious upbringing. I didn't go to church every Sunday or participate in any of the church's activities. I was baptized in the Greek Orthodox Church. My family is Greek Orthodox. And I would say my family are believers, even though we didn't participate very actively in all of the activities. My family, my parents, I would say, and the family that surrounded me were believers. So for me, spirituality, spiritual study, spiritual exploration really came later in life. It wasn't part of my upbringing and part of what shaped my thinking. What shaped my thinking was more, I would say, kind of the logical, the rational. My undergrad is in science. I studied, my degree afterwards was in business, planning, organizing, what can be seen, what can be proven, what can be demonstrated. And so things that were beyond that were a little bit, for me, I'm not sure. That was kind of the world of the unknown, and that wasn't something that I really had a lot of faith in. And so, obviously when I started to go through that inner shift, the books that were coming started coming to me. I started to explore books. And I should say, there was an event that happened, and I will talk about that maybe a little bit later. And it was in another episode, because it has to do with this idea of being guided. Because in the moment that you become willing, each of us becomes willing to explore beyond what we think we know, explore beyond the confines of what we have been taught. New possibilities open up to you. And that is exactly what happened with me. That happened with an experience with a woman who I would call a medium or a psychic, who I went to see, who my best friend had said to me, we have to go see her, we have to go see her. And I didn't want to go see her because I didn't really believe. But I think sometimes when you're willing to overcome your own resistance and be open to go explore beyond what you think you know, then you can have an experience that leads you along a path that maybe you hadn't expected, but that was a path that actually serves where you need to go. And so I'll talk about the details of that later, but that experience kind of opened the door for me and opened the door to say, okay, maybe there is something more. And that really took the form of, what was happening back in 2001 was, I was a fan of Oprah, the Oprah Winfrey Show. And back then it was, her show was on every single day. And she was at that time bringing in all these spiritual teachers. So they became what I was taking in. They became the means through which I would go explore deeper into spirituality. And it was whatever the guest, whoever she had on at the time, which I felt called to me. And so I would go and look up those, their books. Mostly their books. I would go to the bookstore. Again, this is back in 2001. You didn't just go to YouTube or the internet to go find information. You bought the book. And so it was teachers like Gary Zukov. It was teachers like Deepak Chopra, James Redfield. That was another one that really called to me, and many more. And it was, I think, ultimately I came to realize that they're coming at it from different perspectives, but they were all essentially saying the same thing. You need to heal the past. You need to look at it. You need to make peace with all of the pain, all of the ideas that you have had about who you are and what you believe. You need to let go of the need to control and plan every single aspect of your life, and to trust that you're not alone, that that you're loved, that you're guided, that you are so much more than this physical body, and that this world is so much more than it just appears. And it is actually a very loving universe. It's a very loving presence, and a vision that just initially for me was very difficult, because it went completely counter to what I believed up until then. But I was kind of willing to try, because I think for each of us, the decision is going to be a very personal one. I think unless we are willing to say, well, there is something that I maybe don't know, and maybe the interpretations that I have had have been, at the very least incomplete, then I cannot open myself. I cannot receive another way of being in this world. I can't receive another way of thinking, another way of approaching this life. And so, they all were painting a vision that I wanted to try, because I saw that reading those books, when I read those books, there was something that kind of resonated in me. There was something that brought a sense of peace, even though that peace didn't last. And oftentimes it ended, as soon as I closed the book, or I had I met somebody, or I had a conversation that kind of upset me. And so, but I think that willingness to consider this other way was key. I was willing to kind of open my mind a little bit to this vision, open my mind, and to not simply dismiss everything and say, no, this makes absolutely no sense. I can't see how this could ever, work in my life, how this could ever be practical, as nice as it sounds. I was willing to try and put some of these ideas to the test. And I think that was maybe a key in how I was, I was able to move forward. I didn't just kind of take it all in and say, oh yeah, sure, this is great, and I believe it 100%. I said, no, I'm going to put this to the test. I'm going to see, what it's like to do all of these things that they recommend and see if it works for me. See if it does bring a change. See if it does affect me in some way. See if it does bring peace. See if it does bring clarity, because that's ultimately what they all promise you, right? That this vision is going to bring you a sense of peace. So all of that, I was willing to put into practice. I was willing to play with. I was willing to kind of see how it felt for me. And that's really what I was doing. That's what I was doing when I started traveling on my own. And I would say even a little bit before that, into the late 90s, before I began my travels, I was starting to see what it's like to not, have so many plans, to allow myself to be guided, to trust that there is a loving presence in my life. So I was willing to do all that. And that's why I didn't make any plans beyond the one, beyond the return ticket back to Canada a year later. I was willing to put all of this to the test and see if I could in some way create a life for myself that was at its heart based on peace, and that at its very foundation was a sense of meaning, a sense of purpose, something that just went beyond working all the time and making money, which is all good, nothing against that, but there had to be something more. There had to be something more. And I think that's what I was, putting to the test. This is what I was practicing, asking and seeing, what would happen? What would happen? If I did not plan every aspect, like I was talking about, earlier. What if I didn't, let go a little bit of the iron grip that I had on my life until then, with all of my plans and all of my goals and all of the things that I thought I wanted to accomplish in my life? What would happen if I just, let that go a little bit and trusted that there was something guiding me? And, even though I didn't quite really understand what that meant yet initially, what would that be like? What would that feel like? Would I be willing to do just a little bit of that? So, I was starting to play with it a little bit at a time, and, what would happen if I trusted what I couldn't see and touch, right? Because until then, like I said, if I didn't touch it, it didn't exist. But, what if there was something that was beyond my senses that I wasn't aware of, but that I couldn't see because I kept denying it. So of course I couldn't be aware of it. So what if there was something that was there beyond my, the five senses, and there was something that was actually loving and benign and wholly kind and only wanting the best for me, only wanting to offer its love and its guidance, and it did want to communicate with me through, what I came to understand as, the outer signs, these synchronicities, that kind of all these signs that come together, and you go, whoa, this is the probability of this happening is like so remote that it calls your attention, and you go, that cannot be just a coincidence. And what if I just stopped dismissing them? And so maybe there is something here for me to understand, maybe something here for me to interpret, to look at in a different way. We've all had, I'm sure, these kind of powerful intuitions, like an inner knowing, this hunch that you just know that this is true, this is real, this is something that I need to act on. And so this is, maybe that's what's real. Maybe that is something that's actually there. But I just wasn't attuned to it because I had never learned how to be attuned to it. I never considered myself someone who was, or intuitive or extra anything. I considered myself a very rational, very practical person who simply believed in a world that was orderly and functional, mechanical, I guess, in a way would be the way to describe it. But nothing spiritual, nothing that was guiding me. I didn't quite believe that then. That's why all of this was putting all of this to the test. I think I just really trusted a great deal in my mind. I believed that I had the mental capacity, the mental prowess to figure things out. And I don't want to say it. Well, okay, I believed back then I was usually right. What I believed was right. Because I could logically figure things out, right? You can, if you think things through, you apply a little bit of logic, a little bit of reasoning, you can come to a conclusion, right? And so I kind of trusted in that. I trusted in kind of my mental capacity to figure things out. And so this was kind of challenging me to say, well, what if you put that a little bit aside? And what if you allow kind of a different approach to come to you? What if you allow a different interpretation to come? What if you allow yourself to be shown and guided to another way? Again, this is a whole new way of being, which until then for me was completely foreign. This was not something that I understood and that I was sure about, but I was willing. And I think that's the key. I keep coming back to that word, to that willing, because I think that really is the key for being able to kind of move forward, is that willingness to explore another way of understanding and interpreting things. For me, especially back then, I would say it was, there were two books I would say that deeply influenced me. And, one of them was the book Conversations with God, actually the trilogy. I'm not sure if book 3 was out by the time I started walking. I don't think so. I may have bought that afterwards, but definitely books 1 and 2, I devoured those books. I mean, book 1 for me was deeply impacting. It's the Neil Donald Walsh book, Conversations with God, book 1, which describes, a very loving, a very all-inclusive kind of a God, a presence, this love that accompanies you all the time and simply wants you to understand who you are, your true identity. It was a very loving vision, which I had never really maybe seen before. That really resonated with me. So book 1 really resonated with me. Book 2 for me was, amazing. So book 1 was like the personal stuff, the inner work, the kind of the personal interpretations. And book 2 was about, putting all that vision, putting that spiritual vision into action in the world. So book 2 spoke about a global kind of spirituality, how to fix the problems of the world, applying a spiritual vision, talking about economic structures, talking about geopolitical situations, structuring governments, societies, and so on. And it was a way to apply that spirituality, which really appealed to me because, I really believed in action. Action is what is going to fix this world. You identify the problem, you apply this spiritual solution, and the result is peace. That's it. Easy peasy. How hard can that be? And so, action for me was key. And peace in the world for me was about outer action. There was the inner stuff, the inner work, which was personal and, had nothing to do with anybody else and really nobody's business in essence. And there was the inner. So there were two separate worlds for me back then. There was the inner world, which was my responsibility, and, I kept that to myself. There was the outer world, which would be changed through action. I would say here especially, around this line between the inner world and the outer world, this separation, about having these two distinct worlds has really changed. I think that would be where the biggest change, I would say, has happened in these last 25 years. And I'm going to get into that and how it has changed in future episodes. But for now, I would say this artificial line and division between what is the inner world and the outer world, and how that's defined, that is probably where the biggest change has happened in my thinking. And we'll get to that. So, the Conversation with God books, that trilogy was very important at that time. And of course, what ultimately led me to the Camino was the Shirley MacLaine book. Back then, 2001, that was it. There were no other Camino stories, Camino books. It was Shirley MacLaine's My Camino. And I'll never forget, coming across that book that day in the bookstore. It was You know, it was the front cover was facing me, and all I saw on the front cover was the profile of a woman who was walking with, she had a walking stick, she was taking a step forward, she was carrying a backpack, she had a hat. And I thought, without even really knowing anything, that image alone resonated with me. It was just, that's me. And you have to, you know, think, I'm not a camper, I'm not a hiker, I'm a city girl. I had never really gone and done, you know, big hikes and adventure treks or anything like that. Nothing. So this image, for it to touch me so much, was like very surprising to me. And so obviously, you know, I bought it and I read it, and the whole journey was just completely something that touched me, that resonated with me. And I guess going on the Camino really felt like a calling as well. And I guess I was looking for a similar kind of transformational experience, you know, not necessarily her experience, but something that would give me also that, you know, that clarity, and that would give me the answers, that would give me that next step that I was looking for. And, you know, obviously, looking back on this now, 25 years later, I realize now from where I am sitting now, I realize that I was being led to the texts, to the spiritual teachings, to the ideas that would begin the process of kind of undoing, the looking at what I believed and maybe replacing them with something else, this kind of whole shedding process, kind of the undoing, the slow undoing of all of the rigid beliefs, the judgments that I carried, the fears that I had, all of that. I was guided to what would scare me the least, and what I would be able to accept and work with, and wouldn't reject maybe right away, because, you know, obviously there's always that resistance in the beginning of, I don't know what this is saying. And so that I was led to those, to the ones that would kind of take me on that next step, that would help me to continue that next step. And the Camino, you know, really, obviously, those of us who have walked know, everything. You face so much on the Camino. You are facing yourself. You are facing everything. You know, you're facing your fears, your expectations, your judgments, your resentments. You face everything, you know, and so we are facing that as we walk on pilgrimage. And obviously that was my experience as well. You know, it was, the Camino was the action, which I loved. You know, I get to go put all of these things into practice and see what actually works and what doesn't work. And so that was action. And then there was the inner part, which is all of this inner shed, you know, the inner shedding, this kind of, you know, this opening myself up to another way of seeing things or interpreting things, you know, this whole kind of breaking down and facing of all of these things that are buried, and that, you know, often in our day-to-day we don't look at, because, you know, who has time with all of the stuff that's going on in our lives. And so, you know, I love pilgrimage for that. I love pilgrimage for, whether it's on the Camino or anywhere else, this idea of putting your kind of everyday life on hold, in a kind of a, you know, in brackets, put it in brackets for a little bit, and you go on this journey to kind of truly contemplate, because pilgrimage for me is a contemplative journey. It is an inner journey, an opportunity to, you know, really examine what is happening in our lives, and to open ourselves up to receive maybe a different answer than we had always expected, or perhaps to see things in a different way, or perhaps be inspired with actions that we hadn't thought of before. So for me, pilgrimage, I love it. And like I said, not just on the Camino, any opportunity that we have to press that pause on our lives and truly go on a journey where we can just walk and contemplate, walk, reflect, walk, and be open to receiving maybe what we hadn't seen before, and being willing to just shed, release, see things differently. I think that's just so important. So the Camino did both those things for me. It's kind of, you know, it was the action part, which I loved being active, and it was the beginning of that shedding and the breaking down. And, you know, I can say it began literally the very first day. from Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port. It began when I took my first steps. Really, like I said, I'm a city girl. I am not accustomed to camping and packing and carrying backpacks for long periods of time. I didn't really know, I had no idea what I was doing, really. I had just read that book, Shirley MacLaine's book, and said, how hard can it be to walk? I'm a fit person, I had exercised and running and all that. I thought, I'm healthy. I mean, how hard is it to walk? And so, but I had never done a pilgrimage before. And you are tested in a different way on pilgrimage. And so anyways, I didn't know what I needed. I just packed what I thought was appropriate. I had a big red backpack. I would say the backpack weighed easily between 15 to 18 kilograms, without food and without water. I'm 5 feet tall, so, this is a pretty heavy pack on such a small frame. And I just started walking up the Pyrenees from Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port. The guidebook said your first stop is Roncesvalles. I don't remember reading about anything in between. And so I'm not sure how I made it that day, to be honest, because it was cloudy. The fog rolled in, and there were many moments when I couldn't see anything around me, and I was scared. There were hardly any people on the path. I crossed maybe with one or two pilgrims at the time, and they didn't speak English. And my French was very basic, and I certainly didn't have any Spanish. And so here I was. I felt like I was in the middle of nowhere. Anything could happen to me, and no one would know about it. And you didn't. I guess, yeah, I must have registered. I must have bought my pilgrim credential, and so that was a good thing. I did that all in Roncesvalles. But I was also afraid. Not just like I was alone on this path. It was foggy. I was afraid I was going to lose the path because it wasn't as clearly marked. I didn't see. They was telling me follow the yellow arrows, but I couldn't see the yellow arrows all the time. And so I wasn't, I was nervous. I was afraid, but I walked slowly, and eventually I made my way. The up, I would say, was easier than the down. Experienced pilgrims know this. Of course, I didn't have walking poles. I didn't have a walking stick. I was just walking. And so by the time I got to Roncesvalles, I made it. I made it before dark. I found the albergue, and luckily they had a place for me to sleep. They had a bunk bed. It was my first time ever sleeping with so many people in one place. I'd never really stayed in these kinds of accommodations before, so I wasn't exactly sure, what the etiquette was or what to do. I saw more kind of skin around me that I was accustomed to. All of that was new to me. I found, the showers, and cried from the pain, because not only was my body sore, I had blisters everywhere, and the water was freezing. It was a cold shower after a very long day. And so I just stood in that shower and I cried for a little while, and did the best that I could. Just kind of didn't touch the blisters, didn't touch anything, massaged what I could a little, my muscles a little bit. Tried to sleep, could not sleep because of all of the snoring. I didn't know about earplugs either back then. And got up the next morning, was awakened the next morning early, as we all know, because we've got to clear out. And I didn't know what to do. My blisters, some of them had kind of reabsorbed, but there were still a lot of them on my ankles. And I thought, well, there's nothing, I can't do anything right now. I'm just put on the boots and start walking. And I walked. I made it that day to Zubiri, and on the way I thought, I've got to make some changes. Obviously, this is not sustainable. I got to the albergue there. I immediately went through my backpack, the fact that pilgrims that were walking past me, that was the nice thing. Once I got on the, once I got to Roncesvalles from there walking, I came across many more pilgrims, and many would look at my backpack and they would just kind of, chuckle. And, some of them who spoke a little bit of English were saying to me, "Oof, you must be very strong, because, that's very heavy what you're carrying." And so I was like, I obviously have too many things that are in my backpack that I need to shed, symbolic and physical. And I got to Zubiri, the albergue. I went through my entire backpack. I culled it down as best as I could. Other pilgrims saw me, and they also started to, give me advice, pointing to what I needed, what I didn't need. Most of the stuff I shipped back to Saint Jean because I had left my suitcases there, Saint Jean Pied de Port, and many things I just left behind at the albergue. A very kind older gentleman who I had seen when we were walking saw me with my blisters and saw me just looking at them, and he taught me how to thread them. Something I would become quite proficient at on this Camino and on the way to Jerusalem. And, obviously for those who don't know what threading is, it's essentially you take a needle, you sterilize it with iodine, you have a thread, and so you pour the iodine on the needle and thread, and you pop the blister. You put the needle through one side of the blister, you pop it out take it out through the other. The string remains inside. It's filled with iodine, disinfectant, and so it drains the blister while keeping the skin disinfected. And disinfected. And I had literally just strings hanging off of my ankles, but they brought relief, and that was what was important. And I learned how to how to do that. And a couple of days later, I also realized my boots were too heavy. My boots were too chunky. I may have arrived by then to Pamplona, and that was where I said I need to get new boots, which I realize is a no-no, to break in new boots while you're walking. But what I had was just simply too much, too stiff, too hard. And I needed something that was a little bit more flexible, that was a little bit more lightweight, that still had some support. So I found something, I think it was even a Decathlon back then. And I bought them and I broke them in, and they did wonders really for me. I didn't have as many problems as I did when I first, started with my bigger boots. But the thing that I realized with all of that is this whole experience of just kind of doing it on your own and just figure things out and just walk through it and just figure things as you go along. What I realized was that I really wasn't very good at asking for help. I really was not good, and I needed to learn how to ask for help and to accept it. Because for me back then, I was a proud person, a nice person, but very proud in that sense, and that I don't ask for help. I looked at that back then as a sign of weakness. I was the one who always gave help. I was not the one who asked for help. I was the one who figured things out. I was the one, who was in charge, who was kind of leading things, because I had a lot of confidence in my way of interpreting things and figuring things out. I did not know, how to receive anything without feeling this deep obligation to pay it back, because that put me in a vulnerable position. And I didn't like feeling vulnerable. It made me feel vulnerable. It made me feel weak. It made me feel beholden. But part of being able to receive is being willing to allow yourself to not believe that you have to do everything alone. Because up until then, and that's what that kind of showed me, is that I had this idea that I have to do everything alone. I have to figure things out by myself. I am alone. I can only rely on myself. I can only rely on my interpretations, my past experiences, how I have put my ideas together, kind of come up with a conclusion and use that to move forward. But I do that. I do that by myself, and nobody else can help me with that. And so this idea of, receiving help, receiving guidance can't happen if I think I have to keep doing things my way. You know, what I did not appreciate back then, which obviously I do now, is that it was exactly my kind of my determination, my insistence, my kind of my stubbornness, that to do things my way, that were keeping me really from listening, from receiving a different way, and ultimately from advancing, not just on the physical journey, but advancing more importantly on the inner journey. So that was an important kind of the awareness of all of that. And, you know, so many more things, which I'll talk about as we move ahead. But, you know, this whole idea of this shedding, this kind of breaking down, the lightening of what you know you are carrying, loosening these rigid, hard edges, this asking to be shown, asking to be helped, this surrendering a little bit of, you know, my way of doing things, these ideas that I have, what I think is the best, you know, facing the fear and the insecurity that all that brings about, and trusting that, you know, there is a better way, and that it will bring me peace, and that it will help me advance. And, you know, being attentive to all of that, being present, learning, all of that, you know, that is what I called it, the universe, or you can call it the Camino, or that loving presence. That is what it knew that I needed in that moment of my journey. That was the key to being able to advance, not just to get to the destination, not to get to Santiago de Compostela, but that what was needed, what was more important, was what was happening in the inner terrain, how I was walking, how I was approaching everything on that pilgrimage. Because addressing all of that and being willing to surrender them, being willing to heal them, being willing to look at them in a different way, is ultimately what sets the foundation for peace, for the peace that is there to reveal itself, for the peace to show us, to show me the way. And so my part in all of this was being willing. And I keep repeating that word, willingness, being willing, because I think that is such a key component of being able to move forward, a key component of being able to understand peace. You know, it's not easy to undergo this process, because, you know, I was scared in the beginning to do this, because I didn't really know where this process was leading me. I didn't know. It promised a lot of things. It showed a vision. It painted a vision that was lovely, that I wanted, but it's just between where I was and there seemed like an eternity. And it's like, I don't know how I'm going to get there. And it's scary, because, you know, you're leaving behind a lot of things. You're maybe leaving behind relationships. You're leaving behind how people see you. You know, leaving behind the ideas which had defined me and which I had grown up with and which I had lived by. So giving all of that up and seeing it in a different way is scary. And I was afraid, you know, giving up my identity, giving up, you know, the Mony who was, you know, successful, who was, you know, whatever, all of that, giving all that up to assume what was my new identity? Who am I? If I give all of that up, what is it that I become? What do I hold on to? What do I anchor in? So all of that, you know, was being put in front of me to surrender. And if I weren't willing to do that, I don't think I could have progressed, because, you know, and it's understandable, it's completely understandable, you know, this desire to hold on to what we believe, to hold on to our identities as we have framed ourselves. You know, it's easy to understand why you want to do that, why you don't want to give that up, because, you know, it gives you peace. That gives you peace. It gives you a sense of security. We think that if we hold on to it, and that if we hold on to all of this that we know, and we don't let any change enter in, we will have peace. As you know, the whole idea of the devil, you know, you may not like it, it may be causing you pain or suffering, but at least you know what it is. And you can adapt to it. You can, you know, find workarounds. You can find ways to adapt your life in order to be able to make it work. But at least you know what it is and you know what to expect. it's really, it's not really true either, because it gives you the illusion of having peace. It gives you the illusion of a steadiness, or of something that doesn't change, but it's not something that ever lasts, because there's always going to be something, and there's always going to be someone that's going to take you out of that peace, out of that sense of security, out of that sense of feeling stable, that nothing is changing. And so again, this this willingness to let all of that go, and being willing to see things differently is really the foundation of understanding peace. And when I talk about opening myself up to understanding peace, I'm not talking about understanding things based on how the world defines them. I'm not talking about going to talk to experts, going to talk to this person, or getting this different idea. I'm not talking about going to what's already in the world to understand a new way of thinking, or consensus thinking, or what the majority think. I'm actually talking about a paradigm that is outside of the one that we typically operate in, and that we just simply assume is the only one, and it's the only one that's true. So we don't go outside of it. And so, it's like what Einstein said, you cannot solve a situation or a problem from within the consciousness that created it. Because if you could solve it, you would not have that problem. So kind of reasonable, no, when you think of it that way. So you cannot solve a problem or have a unique inspired solution from inside the same consciousness that created that problem. And so the paradigm that I'm talking about is a paradigm that goes outside what we currently understand. Now, I happen to call that a spiritual paradigm, but really what I am talking about is a thought system. I'm talking about a way of thinking, an entire system and way of thinking that is steady, that is reliable, a thought system that I can count on, that is universal in the sense that I can apply it to any situation and be confident that it's going to work and that it's going to bring me peace. A paradigm in which I know when I apply it, it's not, or a thought system that that if there's whatever situation is happening outside, and if circumstances change outside, it's not going to change. This paradigm is still going to bring me to peace. So changing circumstances, are not going to change this. They're always going to bring me to peace. It's unchangeable. So for me, it's a thought system. It's a complete thought. It's a paradigm or a thought system that brings me to a peace that is similarly steady, that is unchanging, that is for always, like kind of eternal in the sense that it doesn't change. So this is the paradigm that I was exploring, and that's really what I was opening myself up to on the Camino, even though I didn't fully understand it, and I didn't know exactly where it was going to lead me. I was willing, but this is essentially this thought system, this paradigm, that loving presence. This was really what I was becoming more confident in, and what was giving me a sense of peace that was more permanent and less shifting, because of outer situation, that didn't change as much when different circumstances came or different experiences came into my life that would take me out of that peace. And so this is what I was getting better at. And I think if I did not have the experience and that practice, especially that practice of being willing to look at things differently, to do the inner work, to do the healing work, to be led, to be guided, to trust that I was being guided in a loving way that was ultimately for my highest good and for the good of all. If I didn't believe any of that, or practice it and really have more confidence in it, there is no way I could have walked to Jerusalem, because that really became the foundation of being in this world, of moving in this world, where I could let myself surrender a little bit more and let myself be shown. And had I not done this, I don't think I would have recognized that call to walk to Jerusalem when it came, because I would not have been present. I would not have been paying attention. I would have, heard the conversation that I heard at that time that came, and I would have just said, "Oh yeah, how nice, that's interesting," and moved on, continued on to the next day's walk. And so this is kind of what I wanted to share with you today, this idea of being willing as the foundation for understanding what peace is. Being willing to look outside of what we think we know and to explore a paradigm and a thought system that leads us to something that's more lasting, that's more permanent, that's more eternal. So let's leave it here for now. I hope you enjoyed this segment. I hope it left you with some things to contemplate in your own life, because ultimately, this is not just about going on a pilgrimage or going on a big long walk for peace and not applying them to when we get off our pilgrimage. This is about a way of living, a way of thinking, a way of approaching our life that is something that we can carry with us in every instant. So I hope this has served you. I hope you'll join me next time as we continue this inner journey, as we continue this pilgrimage for peace. Thanks for watching, and thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Buen camino, everybody. Bye for now.